Welcome to Micro-Digressions. Hopefully, welcome back to Micro-Digressions. I'm Spencer Case, your host as always. Here today, I am with Nathan Cofnas. How are you doing, Nathan?
Very well. Thanks for having me on.
And we're going to talk about wokeness. I thought I would begin with a point of agreement between us. Because each of us has been saying for a long time now that this conventional wisdom, that wokeness has peaked, that this is going away, that is not true. So I'll let you take the lead on that.
Well, the first question is, well, what is wokeism? It's a word people throw around a lot, often to refer to any kind of left-coded beliefs that they disagree with. That wokeism is supposed to be trans theory. Trump says it's denying that he won the election in 2020 is woke. The HR tyranny is considered wokeism. The feminization of the institutions is wokeism, and tearing down statues is wokeism. So what is it, and how would we know if we discovered the correct definition of wokeism? Well, woke is just a word, and we can define it however we like. There's no objectively correct definition out there in the universe for us to discover. But there is an objective truth about the fact that something happened around 2012 at the beginning of the Great Awakening. There was something out in the world that drove people to get very excited about various issues, largely connected to race, and that the emotional intensity of this peaked around 2020 to 2022, 3, and then appears to have lost some momentum. I'll say about that in a minute. And I think that we can identify what that is, which is that there was a reaction. This was a reaction to the belief that all groups of people are born with the same innate distribution of socially relevant traits, and that therefore any disparities among groups must be the result of environmental factors which could in principle be fixed, corrected. And given that many of these disparities, socioeconomic disparities, disfavor groups that were in fact historically subject to oppression, such as blacks vis-a-vis whites in America, the most obvious explanation for what that environmental factor would be is racism, either the legacy of past racism or the continuation of racism in a more or less subtle form. Wokeism says, well, there's terrible injustice. Something about the environment causes African Americans to have an average IQ of 85, 15 points lower than the white average, something like 10% of the wealth, and an incarceration rate of 7 times more than whites. So there's a moral emergency to correct the environment and bring about equality of outcome, which is what we would have without this injustice. And the empirical premise of wokeism, which is the equality thesis, that all groups have the same or innately the same, that has a long history. And going back to John Locke in 1690, and then picked up by French revolutionaries and John Stuart Mill, and all sorts of leftist or liberal-leaning characters who were attracted to this for purely ideological reasons. And it became it started to become the orthodoxy among a group of liberal intellectuals in kind of the 1880s. And the orthodoxy started crystallizing in the early to mid 20th century. And then after World War II, this very strong taboo was established to protect this view that old people are the same and that we should not be allowed to investigate or question this claim in any way. And We spent basically 3 generations trying to equalize the environment, and the result was not successful. And it was inevitable that we were going to reach a turning point where people said, okay, enough of this. We want equality now. We want to fix the injustice now. And that was the Great Awakening.
Okay, I was going to postpone this debate until later, but since you just took the bull by the horns, we'll just get into it. One point of disagreement here is that I don't think that this has as much to do with blank slatism as you seem to think. I think that the overriding premise here that matters is a normative belief, a belief that we ought to be equal, we ought to be made equal, which you can have. Notice that's logically independent of any claims about empirical group or individual equality or anything like that. I think it's true that we're obviously looking at something that is a descendant, like a secular descendant of Christian morality. Among secular society, there's still this commitment to the idea of like everyone is equal before God or something like that. But that has sort of been internalized even when the theology has fallen away, and people don't recognize that this is that they're parroting ideas that are Christianoid or something like that, Christian through some sort of carnival funny mirror. People don't recognize that. It's very, very obvious, though, that if you read like Robin DiAngelo, that white racism has just simply taken the place of original sin in this kind of secular quasi theology. It's very obvious that that has happened. And if you read like Dominion by Tom Holland about the history of Christianity, he traces this himself pretty clearly how these ideas are sort of descended from a kind of Christian morality. But I think where I disagree with you is that I think they're interested in leveling inequalities where they find them, right? So yeah, they find them here. They find them between races, and they're interested in leveling that, and they're interested in using sort of these verbal tools developed in academia to sort of pressure people into agreement with this. But that could persist. That could easily persist, even if everybody accepted this hereditarianism that you seem to think is the solution for everything.
To clarify, an empirical premise by itself doesn't generate wokeism. You also need a moral premise. So the full definition of wokeism is that it's what you get from taking the equality thesis seriously, given a background in Christian morality. Now, there's a question, does it really need to be Christian morality, or could it be some other morality that in combination with the equality thesis could generate wokeism? So I think that it doesn't have to be Christianity per se. It could be any moral principle that demands that people have that all people have the right to achieve their potential. Now, if you think that African Americans, Jewish Americans, and Japanese Americans are born from the moment of conception have exactly the same potential on average, and they have such radically different outcomes, then there's a huge amount of potential that's being lost among the group that is suffering this deficiency of 20, 25 IQ points or something like that compared to the other. And so I, who reject Christian morality, would still be woke if I believed in the equality thesis. But in practice, most people's ethical views are a legacy of Christianity. And so you see how the way that they express wokeism is clearly informed by Christianity. Many elements of woke practice and woke belief have obvious parallels in Christian theology and Christian practice. Concepts like original sin, as you were saying, and penance, good and evil conflicts that I would not be attracted to if I were woke. But as long as you have any kind of moral you're committed to some moral principle that would not allow you to tolerate a situation where injustice leads to to these massive disparities, will create wokeism.
Oh yeah, maybe wokeism in a slightly different flavor or form, but it would still be essentially the same phenomenon. I guess I'll ask this question, and we'll circle back to our disagreement, but do you have, because I actually don't know this, do you know why the fixation has been so much on group rather than individual differences?
Well, if we go back to Locke, so Locke is the father of liberalism, and he's the father of blank slatism. So it's not a coincidence that, and he's also although people don't put it this way, he's also the father of race denial, because he said not only are individuals blank slates, but that there's no difference between individuals from different racial groups, and that if an African person were raised in Britain, then he would, be a mathematician just like an Englishman. So it's not a coincidence that liberal or leftist political views go with blank slatism and race denial, because leftism is, I'm not going to try to define what leftism is, but it is associated with this attitude that you can correct nature to align with your moral vision, which is in a way that's different from the conservative outlook. So it's much more amenable to the leftist way of seeing the world, to understand, to see maximum malleability in humanity. Now, there were many leftists who were committed blank slatists, who denied that there are any individual differences. There are some conceptual distinctions to make here between blank slatism and the denial of individual differences, but I won't get into that. But for a long time, that was the leftist position, that you take any child from any, is basically interchangeable as long as there hasn't been some physical damage to the nervous system or something. That, okay, there may be physical differences, but at least as far as anything above the neck, right, it's all determined by the environment. Now, I think that the only reason leftists gave this up is because the conflict with reality was so enormous that it was just impossible to maintain the delusion among intelligent people. And there are people who are still blank slatists and people who at least claim to believe that everybody can be an Einstein. But among the vast majority of intelligent people are not that deluded at this point in history. Given all the failures of communism and other ideologies to mold people to the desired way, people have given that up, but they're still clinging to the idea of group sameness. So, okay, well, we're willing to admit that individuals might be different on average, but for genetic reasons, but we're going to stop there.
When do you think that happened?
So I'm not aware of any survey data that would answer that question, but just based on my reading of intellectual history, it was sort of the mid to late 20th century where that idea really died out. The idea of genuine blank slatism. So the evolutionary psychologists are famous for attacking blank slatism, and they kind of have their own insular community where they make fun of the blank slatist and what they call the standard social science model, which is basically blank slatism. And if you talk to their critics, the critics now, almost all the critics say that they're straw manning, that the evolutionary psychologists are straw manning their opponents. So even in relatively leftist activist university departments, they're still complaining that the evolutionary psychologists are straw manning them for calling them blank slatists, because they say we're not blank slatists. But as far as denial of individual differences, if you look at like the New York Times science section, talking heads on television programs, like nobody is promoting the idea that everybody is born the same, that everybody can be an Einstein. And education policy seems to implicitly accept that people think that we can do a lot better, and they vastly overestimate the power of education and the environment to improve human capital. But you don't hear people saying that all individuals are the same.
So, yeah, you think that the empirical claim of group equality, we'll say, combined with Christian morality, is what generates political, I guess I would say this, I think you would say this too, generates political correctness, which reached a certain level of amplification due to social media and institutional saturation and that kind of thing, like in the 2010s, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it was also the realization that everything else that we tried wasn't going to work. Like another generation of affirmative action and Black History Months or whatever was not going to bring about equality. And people realize that. So we have to take radical action now. Now, there are a number of other trends. One of the benefits of having a definition of wokeism is you can put it in ideological context and compare it with other ideologies or other intellectual or social developments that are happening at the same time. Now, besides wokeism, which has existed for a long time and then just reached this crescendo, in the Great Awakening, you also have the feminization of the universe, of the institutions, and you also have gender theory, which has a completely different. People frequently conflate gender theory with wokeism, which of course they can define woke however they like, but this is philosophically and historically a separate phenomenon from the race stuff. The race stuff, race denial, and the idea that we have to bring about equality. This goes back hundreds of years and has been a major tenet of leftism for well over a century. Gender theory existed as a really niche view in the gay rights movement and in certain radical university departments for 50 years or whatever it is. And it gained mainstream acceptance very suddenly around 2015 and is already kind of waning. I think it's going to survive in some form, not in such, it's not going to be as radical as it was last several years. So, and if we got rid of gender theory and if we got rid of somehow pushed back against the feminization of the institutions, but we kept the obsession with race and racial bean counting and injustice about race, there would still be wokeism. Right?
Yeah, so I think I disagree with your wanting to put the gender stuff in a different category. For one thing, I think one desideratum in coming up with a definition of wokeism is, if you're going to do that. By the way, I'll just say I don't know how essential it is to just begin every conversation with how do you define wokeism. We all know well enough what it is. I think it's good to be more precise about it, but I think it's kind of unfair to asking the average conservative, how do you define wokeism? Oh, you can't give a definition. Oh, well, then presumably this is something that doesn't exist. It's like, well, if you've spent any time trying to give a conceptual analysis of anything talking about Plato in a philosophy class, like it's hard to define what a freaking sandwich is. Why is an apple pie not a sandwich or something like that? But we pretty much know what a sandwich is, and we pretty much know what wokeism is, I would say, for everyday purposes. I mean, for us, of course, we're doing the academic game. We should try to give something approximating a good enough definition. But I don't know. I think demands for a definition in ordinary discourse are a little bit silly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, demands for definitions can be abused. If I say, it was unjust to shoot the stranger in the back randomly, for fun, right?
Yeah.
If I say that's unjust, well, what is justice?
It's injustice, yeah.
Right? So, and let's say I'm just like some random person. Should I? Yeah. I'm not a philosopher. I have no idea how to go about defining justice. Like, does that invalidate my statement that it was unjust to shoot the random stranger in the back for fun? I don't think so. However, that is because people have this kind of working understanding of what at least paradigm cases of justice are, even if they don't have a definition. And they recognize that shooting random strangers in the back for fun is close to the paradigm, what is understood as a paradigm of injustice, and therefore that was not just. Now, I don't think that's always the case. And there are cases where it is appropriate to ask for a definition. So if you say that you're against scientism, and then you accuse me of being being guilty of scientism, and I say, well, what is that? So I don't have to give you a definition. You're just guilty of scientism. Answer the accusation. It's not. That's not. It doesn't work that way. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, so you have to give me a hint. Like, tell me. And also, even when it comes to justice, we do try to define justice. Like, that is an important thing. We've been talking about how to define justice for thousands of years. So this isn't. So there's no way to get around our responsibility to define what wokeism is if we think that's an important thing to talk about and to analyze. Now, I think in the case of wokeism, there's so much confusion about it, where people just use it to refer to anything that they don't like or anything kind of on the left, that I think that discussions of wokeism really should start with the definition of, or some indication of, well, what are we talking about?
Okay, but that definition has to give some kind of have some kind of proximity to like the widely recognized paradigm cases. Or if not, then let's just dispense with it and let's just come up with another term for this. Because I thought an absolutely central marker of wokeness would be the pronouns in the bio. In fact, if you ask someone what is an indication of a woke person, that might be the very first thing that might come to mind. But you want to say that's a different phenomenon. But to me, like the parallels are so clear between the gender theory stuff and the BLM race stuff that if you are, it just seems, it cries out for a unified explanation. It certainly seems that both of these things are conduits of a kind of Christian morality in a secular culture with this hyper concern about equality. So to say that they're different things, it makes me think like, well, you're giving an account that's too narrow here.
Okay, so what if I put my pronouns in my bio, either ironically or not, let's say non-ironically, and I said, you know what, I thought about it and I realized that this whole gender thing makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to show that I'm an ally, and I can put my pronouns in my bio, but I have all the same views about race. I think there should be a hereditary revolution, and we should accept that racial disparities are just part of nature and something we have to make peace with. Would you say that I'm still a paradigm wokester?
I would not say that you were a paradigm wokester. I said this was a paradigm signifier of wokeness, right? I didn't say that it made you one, but like this is signifier.
Okay, but so yeah. I agree. The correlation is strong. There's a correlation, but there's a question philosophically, conceptually, are these beliefs that are just happen to be correlated with each other for various reasons, or are they stemming from the same ideology?
They're stemming from the same ideology, I would say. And I would say you could be woke in some areas and not others. Like you could be a race hereditarian, and I agree that counts very seriously against your being woke, but you could still count as woke in some sense if you were like constantly going around calling people out for their microaggressions against non-binary people kind of stuff. That would still be woke-ish behavior, and you'd still be partly there, I would say.
So I think that there's some non-accidental connection between gender theory and wokeism because of the fact that both of them are rooted in a non-biological way of thinking. But would you agree that historically, we have hundreds of years before people are talking about this gender stuff, people are saying that the races are the same, and that under equal conditions, they would have equal outcomes. And it's just a historical fact that people have been making that claim for a lot longer than they've been making the gender claim. And the gender claim, the gender theory developed within this radical gay rights movement, and then kind of came out of left field like 10 years ago. And then, it became the kind of people who are attracted to the race communism, then many of them adopted this the gender theory. But you agree that historically they come from different places.
I think that there's been some independent development there. I think Plato was pretty blank slatist about the sexes in parts of the Republic, if I recall. But yeah, I think there's been some independent development, but I see a common ideology here, and I would say it's normative, not descriptive egalitarianism. And then that it's sort of taken up by different people who focus on different aspects of that idea, right? So Judith Butler was doing one thing, and who was I guess Peggy McIntosh was doing another thing at around the same time. But I see these as conduits of one kind of, one central ideology. And by the way, it's not a coincidence too that there are certain economic views associated with wokeness that again don't have anything to do with like genes or hereditarianism or whatever. The 1% is exploiting the 99%, this kind of stuff. This is part of the same general passion for equal outcomes expressing itself in another context, but it's the same thing, I would say.
But wokesters are not generally egalitarian. They're quite happy with Oprah having billions of dollars. What they're bothered by is the group disparities. As far as like the 1% stuff, people on the racist right are often have exactly those same views. People like, Tim Pool, I don't know about him. Maybe he's not on the racist right. But a lot of these people are basically communists on the white nationalists, the racists. So I don't see that as having some intrinsic connection to anything about wokeism.
It's horseshoe theory. You go far enough on the right and the left, it does meet. It's somewhere Foucault-ish. It's all about power, baby, is where it meets if you just keep going to the extremes. But yeah, I guess I do think you're defining it too narrowly. And I do think if we could snap our fingers and make everybody convinced of genetic racial differences or whatever, I don't see this playing out the way that you see this playing out. I think this would be because have you read Cohen's Why Not Socialism? You must have.
I think I skimmed it a long time ago, but I'm not.
In which an a priori thought experiment about camping with like your five besties is supposed to generate a really powerful argument against capitalism. That's a little unfair, but it's supposed to generate intuitions that motivate socialism or what,
No, there will still be communists. There will still be socialism. Socialism goes back hundreds of thousands of years in human history. Hunter-gatherers are universally socialist. That is the natural system, political system of humanity. And it's not a huge surprise that people try to recreate the socialist hunter-gatherer tribe on a mass scale, which obviously doesn't work on that scale. Or it did, but we would be as poor as hunter-gatherers, since we wouldn't like
okay.
it.
So defeating, if I feel like your definition of wokeness it's too closely identified with your personal project of promoting hereditarianism. Like,
but it's not a coincidence that that's my project and it's my definition. I realized that was the important thing, and then I made it my project.
I think the important thing is the normative. That we ought to be equal. We ought to have equal outcomes.
But
I think that's
wokesters don't believe in that. They don't believe in equal outcomes. They only believe that they're fine with billionaires and CEOs and people having
instrumentally
status.
Instrumental.
I don't think so. I don't think it's just instrumental. I think wokesters, that's just not part of the woke crusade. Now, there are people on the left who are communists and who are against that kind of inequality, but that's not the main focus. It was Robin DiAngelo has no qualms about being a millionaire herself, right, and charging tens of thousands of dollars to give a talk.
Well, neither did the actual communists, but they're still ideologically committed.
I mean, she has no qualms. She does it openly and without any shame, and none of her supporters have taken her to task for that, because that's not part of the idea. Now, I don't think that a genuine communist could get away with that kind of behavior. I mean, look, Kamala Harris wears a $10,000 watch. Like this is like the head of the DEI. Like, this is who the wokesters wanted to be president. They're not communists. They're not.
And yet she talks very explicitly about wanting us all to end up at the same place. Yes, there's
races, not individuals. She doesn't say that about.
She makes it as a general statement. We should all end up at the same place. I mean, race might be the focus for this, but I think it's a more general normative thing that's driving this.
I don't know who is going around saying that we need all individuals to be equal. That's communism. These are woke neoliberals are not trying to recreate some Soviet utopia. They just want equal outcomes among groups who they claim are innately identical, which, given their views, their empirical views, is a very reasonable thing to want, and is what I would want if I shared their belief in the equality thesis.
Okay, set aside the thing about individual differences, and let's just focus about group differences. You could still be obsessed with group equality as a normative ideal and be a hereditarian, right?
As a matter of logic, yes, that's a logically possible. So, how would that commitment express itself?
Here's how it would express itself. I actually think Charles Murray has a view like this, actually, where you could be a luck egalitarian. You're a luck egalitarian. I suppose it would be, you would be thinking about it as this would ultimately be about individual differences, but group differences would be one expression of group differences that would be, of individual differences that would be the primary nexus of concern. You'd think like, hey, look, different people are born with different genetic potential, and that's not fair. That's not fair. And the world is like cosmically unequal, but we need to correct for that. We need to do some leveling down to make these groups equal, to correct for this cosmic unfairness. Okay. You could think, and I think there are, I couldn't name any, but I do think there are egalitarians who think this way. They're concerned about group equality as an ideal. And you don't really need this. I agree with you that, as a matter of fact, wokeism is connected with this oppression hypothesis for explaining group differences. But I don't think you need to have that feature in order to be obsessed with making groups equal.
So this is the topic of my next Substack essay, which is called "Hereditarian Race Communism is Not Going to Happen." Yes, there's a logically possible view that you could say, the luck egalitarian view, that, okay, if this racial group has worse outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes due to innate disadvantage, then that just means we have a responsibility to compensate them for nature's unfairness. Now, that's a logical view. It's a logically possible view. The question is whether this is actually going to be a viable ideology that's going to attract people and who are going to fight for it. Now, if it were such an attractive ideology, why is there not a single example, not one, of a prominent example of somebody who acknowledges hereditarianism and says that this is the conclusion, is that we just need to try to people with higher capacities, or the capacity to generate more wealth, should work to transfer to those less able to generate wealth. There is not one person. People say Catherine Page Harden, but Catherine Page Harden, now, of course, if you took her kind of genetic lottery, luck egalitarianism seriously, then it would imply that if you were a hereditarian, then you would have this view. But she didn't. She rejects hereditarianism. She says there's no evidence for hereditarianism between groups, only between individuals. Freddie DeBoer, he says exactly the same thing. So if it were so easy to reconcile this leftist ideology with hereditarianism, I think there would be one example of somebody who acknowledged that hereditarianism and then came to this conclusion. But the reality is that wokesters recognize that they're not going to get anywhere with this, and that hereditarianism is a stake in the heart of their ideology, and they have no option but to just reject it. I mean, imagine a politician or making this argument that, okay, nature has created this unfairness, but you from this group have to work 4 months a year to pay taxes to give it over to this group just because evolution has worked it out this way. That we have this theory called luck egalitarianism that says you have to do this. That's not going to fly.
Yeah, no politician would ever say anything the way you would say it. But why are they not? I mean, they don't have to. It's not like what do you think is going to happen? Like, suppose everyone, tomorrow, everyone realizes your views are right. Let's say, do you think the people in all of the diversity engineer positions are going to say, well, I guess there's no need for us. We got to pack up and go. No, they're going to find another rationale. This one is ready at hand. It's right there. They could easily push it. They could easily just be egalitarians of a non-hereditarian sort. And indeed, in economics, most of these people are already egalitarians.
Many people in the DEI industrial complex are fanatics who are never going to change their mind under any circumstances. And they're in it. They don't care what the truth is. Maybe they do care, but they're totally delusional. This isn't about changing everybody's minds. This is about creating a different informational environment where smart, morally sensitive people will make an investigation into why are these massive why do these massive disparities exist, and what is our responsibility with respect to correcting them, or what should our response to this be? And if hereditarianism, the facts about hereditarianism are available from credible sources in a way that intelligent people can understand, then we will take the wind out of the sails of wokeism and this movement to futile movement to try to bring about equality.
Among the DEI bureaucrats, you've got a small number of true believers and a larger number of people who would go along with the shifting winds. I think they'd be happy to become luck egalitarians as a pretext for continuing to do what they do.
Well, there's an interesting question about, well, when or do people ever change their minds about anything important? So this is something that I'm going to get into in the coming Substack post. In short, there does seem to be a sensitive period in childhood and adolescence where people imprint on certain beliefs and values, and it's very difficult to erase those once you make it to adulthood. Okay, there are exceptions. There are some individuals who remain open to new ideas. When's the last time you saw a 70-year-old change his mind, or even a 25-year-old change his mind about something important? It's very rare. Now, there are occasions, and this is not just my intuition, this is supported by data. If you look at the World Values Survey, over time, society becomes more liberal, but it's because each new cohort is more liberal than the others. If you look at people born in the 1920 to 1930, 1930 to 1940, their cohort remains basically the same over their life. As soon as they're tested, they change a little bit in response to inflation, the economic shocks. So inflation rates can make people, if inflation is high, people become a little more conservative. But apart from that, beliefs, values tend to be pretty stable. Kids, people who were born, Germans who were born in the 1920s and 30s, remained significantly more anti-Semitic than other Germans when they were measured in 1996. And interestingly, they were more anti-Semitic than Germans who were born in the 1910s. So Germans who were born in the 1910s experienced not the same Nazi propaganda as adults, whereas the people who were born, even when they were exposed, Germans born in 1939, who just within the first 6 years of their life got a dose of the Nazi education system, they were also twice as anti-Semitic as other Germans. So there is this period where if you've been indoctrinated to be woke, to believe in the equality thesis and to believe there's a moral emergency to correct disparities, those people are probably going to be lost for the most part. So this is about the rising generation. Now there is a caveat to this, is that sometimes there are cases where people do change their mind. And a notable example of this is with respect to trans issues, so and gender issues in general. So in the World Values Survey, support for divorce and homosexuality did go up among all birth cohorts in the last 30 years, but that was kind of an exceptional case. So it's theoretically possible, but I wouldn't count that.
By the way, I think that one of the main causes of wokeness in why it happened when it did, I think the Obergefell decision had a lot to do with it. And my reasoning is it wasn't just the decision itself, recognizing gay marriage across the U.S., I'm sure you know, but just for the listeners, it wasn't just the decision itself, but it was more like this is the capstone on the gay rights movement being successful and capturing the culture and the institutions. And I think there were a bunch of activists who thought, let's do that with everything. Let's do that with race and abortion and just everything. And the idea that if we just push really, really hard and call our opponents bigots and be really uncompromising, we can conquer. So, and then it also freaked out the right, and I think that partly explains the why the right was galvanized as well. So I think that's a contributing factor to this. What do you think?
Well, that court case, if I remember correctly, was 2015. That
Right.
was that was a reflection of the zeitgeist. I think that was a consequence rather than a cause. Sexual ethics have been liberalized to such a degree that even these, boomer or maybe even silent generation judges realize that, okay, we want to be on the right side of history. And so they just invented this constitutional right that, in light of new moral sensibilities. But I don't know that the SCOTUS decision on its own was a huge factor in the trajectory of the culture. And that these developments occurred in other Western European countries, Anglophone countries, around the same time. You could trace it back to the court case, but I think the more parsimonious explanation is that these ideas had just been percolating for several years, and then they finally broke through.
Yeah, it was certainly both. I think it was a cause and also an effect of stuff that was already happening. It was one inflection point. It was certainly the point at which the trans stuff started getting more prominent. Like that happened like almost immediately after the Obergefell decision. It is really interesting, though, how rapidly it happened. Like it was like in my view, it was political correctness before it was called wokeness, and that had been slowly making its way through the institutions, the university in particular, for decades. And if you want some proof of this, just read some culture war books from the early '90s and from the '80s, and it's startlingly similar. So read Nat Hentoff's "Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee," for example. Patai and Cortez's book Professing Feminism from 1994, various other books. It was clearly this was in the air, but it was mostly confined to humanities departments, and it just suddenly burst out onto the scene. And you can just go back to like 2009, 2010 to find examples of people saying things in public that that in 2016 it would have been like career suicide to say. It's really startling why it happened then. I think it's social media has to be the explanation. That and the iPhones, and that plus the saturation of the institutions having already happened in the by the mid 2000s. I think that has to explain the timing.
Well, social media was definitely a catalyst, but it's not like we needed iPhones in order to have purity spirals and witch hunts and all that. I mean, these are not new human phenomena, right? It's again, social media facilitates this and influences the form that the witch hunts are taking. But we're not seeing anything that seems to represent a radical break from human nature as we've seen it function throughout history. It's just that the ideology now that is animating us which is the main source of moral energy for large numbers of people, is this feeling of racial grievance, that there's this injustice that has been committed against certain racial groups. And the proof is simply, well, we're all the same, and yet we have massive persistent disparities.
I got to ask you, why do you think, you seem to think this is obvious. To me, it's much less obvious. So you're dismissive of cultural explanations for group differences. And so you think it's sort of obvious that with the rejection of hereditarianism, the oppression narrative is just the only way to go. It's just the only way to go for the elites. But I guess I still don't understand why, if the elites are willing to, just double and triple down on things like stereotype threat and implicit bias being hugely causally important, which just seems more and more implausible. If they're willing to double down on things like this, they could easily have doubled down on some kind of conservative culturalist explanation, even if it's as empirically unsupported as you say. They could have just come up with more and more desperate ways of trying to make that work, just as they have in fact been doing with the empirical side of the oppression narrative. So why is it like a foregone conclusion that it didn't go that way? It had to go in the oppression narrative way.
I missed it. What was the other option? The cultural explanation?
Yeah. Some kind of, doubling down on that.
Well, I mean, the cultural explanation is just an indirect route back to wokeism, because whose fault is the culture? And we have this culture which is somehow victimizing the same group of people all over the world. So, okay, so where does the bad culture come from? Like, it's unlikely that people are going to come up with a theory for that doesn't trace back to the some sort of wrongdoing on the part of the oppressor races, and then there will be a moral imperative for them to correct this injustice. It's also an empirical fact that very few people find these cultural explanations convincing. The most well-known cultural explanation for race differences is Thomas Sowell's theory that African Americans adopted the dysfunctional culture of white rednecks in the South, and that this is responsible for everything that has happened. This theory, from a scholarly perspective, is completely bankrupt. I've analyzed it, and you may have seen my analysis of this on Substack. Virtually every statement that Thomas Sowell makes that can be evaluated is just factually wrong. There's some suggestive evidence that you may cite data that don't exist. And he's the best, he's the most prominent cultural theorist, as far as I know. And people are just not buying this. And the National Review then Hoover Institution conservatives have been pushing it for decades, and it has not caught on. So people do not find it convincing. As an empirical matter, people don't find it convincing. Now, even if they did, hypothetically, well, it's just another way back to wokeism, because you'll blame whites for this bad culture and say, well, we have the responsibility, if there's a moral emergency, to fix the bad culture.
Okay, I don't see why it must be the case that if there's some cultural dysfunction, oppression has to lie at the nexus of that, right? Like, there's certain individuals, like just think of the individual case. I could have bad habits. I do have some bad habits, but I could have more bad habits, and it could be just it's my personality, it's my life experience. It's not something that the world is collectively responsible for. My community is collectively responsible for. Certain communities might have so. This is something I think has held up. Apparently, Southerners in the U.S. are much more likely. There's more of an honor culture there, and they're much more likely to get into fights and be confrontational. Like they've had these experiments. This is this is 20 years old now. I don't know if it's replicated, where they would have people walk by and shoulder
But I
bumping.
think that was a victim of the replication crisis.
Was it? Was it?
I believe so.
Okay. Okay.
I have to double check, but I'm quite sure that it was.
Okay. I believe you. I believe you. Whether or not that particular study has shown that certain groups have a greater preference for aggression, that could be the case. And there's no reason to think that it must be a response to oppression, right? Like it could just be a preference and a bad preference that a group has. I don't understand why.
I mean, that could very well be. So first, I want to make a general comment about the relationship between culture and biology, which is that, yes, culture behavior is affected by both your genetic potential and the cultural influence. Okay. But when you look at culture, where does the culture come from? It's not a total coincidence that certain cultures are attached to certain groups of people. It's not a coincidence that you have a certain culture among Chinese in Singapore and Chinese in China and Chinese in the United States and Chinese in Southeast Asia, and that they're not exactly the same, but there are certain commonalities between those cultures. And now I think don't need to spell out the obvious that there is some influence, some genetic influence of the average traits of the population influence the culture, which in turn reinforces those traits that generated the culture in the first place. Now, if you take a Jew and he's adopted by a Chinese family, he will in certain respects act more like a Chinese person than the average Jew would, and vice versa. But if you take 1 million Chinese people on the one hand and 1 million Jews on the other hand, and you leave them to their own devices, they're going to create different cultures, which have somewhat predictable differences between them. Now, there is an honor culture in the South in a way that there isn't in the North. That's true. Whether that experiment replicates or not. That doesn't mean that genes have no role to play in the story. There are very different people who settled in the South and the North, different ethnically, and also there are self-selected people who are attracted to live in the South or the North. So, I wouldn't, I think it would be dangerous for one for the cultural theorist to hang his hat on the existence of these cultural differences, which can be, easily potentially traced back to genetic differences.
Yeah, this is one problem I think exists with Sol's account that I had thought of even before reading your piece, which is in one place he points out that the different outcomes from American blacks who are descended from freedmen, people who escaped from slavery or were born free in the North, and those who were enslaved through the entire period of the Civil War, and he up through the Civil War until emancipation. And he says he hypothesizes that there's a cultural difference between a culture of freedom and a culture of enslavement, and then this was subsequently passed down through generations. So I think that's prima facie credible, but the problem is that you have not isolated hereditary variables in this, because you would expect the people who escaped from slavery and the people who worked their way out of it and got out of it in other ways wouldn't be exactly like the population that stayed.
They're
Could that
completely different populations,
Yeah.
as I pointed out in the essay. The freedmen tended to be the descendants of slave owners and the slaves. So it was a mulatto population. And in fact, Thomas Sowell himself gives a number of names as examples of people, blacks, who had this cultural advantage of the freedmen and were intellectually successful. And he says, see, this shows the power of culture. So I went and I looked up those names, and these people had 1/8 black ancestry. It's completely absurd. They're white. They're only black according to this one drop rule. So his own examples of blacks overcoming this disadvantage with culture are, for all intents and purposes, white people. So yeah, not persuasive at all.
Yeah, so there's some problems. Yeah, I you've convinced me. I was already sort of shaky on some of his arguments. I went back and reread some of it, and it wasn't nearly as persuasive as I remembered it being. And then I read the piece. I'm curious though. Do you want to go? Do you want to go so far as to say that culture is just not an independent variable on these outcomes? Like, it doesn't matter at all the important. So because I've been thinking, like, if you state hereditarianism in a really modest way, it seems kind of hard to resist. It just seems implausible that you would have all of these different groups that would have exactly the same distributions of traits of the kind that we care about. Especially, I think you were alluding to this earlier, if you have a group that just sort of spontaneously develops a cultural predilection for, I don't know, say a more collectivistic culture or a more individualistic culture, you would then expect there to be evolutionary pressures in favor of people whose traits made it more likely that they could get along in that kind of culture. So it just so very weak hereditarianism seems like it's got to be right, but it seems like you want to push it to this other extreme where there's not any room for any kind of like cultural or historical contingency or cultural choice. Everything just comes down to genes. Is that a straw man? Am I straw manning you?
Yes. Yeah. Look, obviously culture is important. Culture has a real effect on outcomes. My point is just that cultures don't develop randomly. They don't come out of nowhere. You can't say that, well, Chinese have this features of Chinese culture are conducive to, let's say, doing homework. So let's just take this culture that leads to more homework and just place it on some other population that doesn't do as much homework, and then that will solve the problem. Like, no, that they have this culture for a certain reason, which can't just be picked up and placed on another population. So, but now that doesn't mean that you can't, that there isn't a lot of opportunity to alter the culture even within a group. And like, think about how our culture has been shaped just by random sentences written in the Bible. Like, if it hadn't been written in the Bible, it wouldn't be part of our culture. It's just because John decided to say it that all these consequences followed. Like, so that's a purely cultural phenomenon. And there are many other examples. Like, now, but I'm saying there are limits to that. And also, when you're trying to separate genetic and culture, genes and environment as a cause, I'm saying they're not entirely separate from each other. So there is some interaction between the genes and the culture.
Granting that culture doesn't arise in a ex nihilo with no genetic influence, and granting that there is this interaction, do you not see any possibility of doing the things that like the National Review conservatives you deride? I don't know. I feel like that's aimed at me, even though I'm not. I haven't written for them for a long time. But I do think culture is important. I do think it's a huge important part of the disparities that we worry about, and that maybe some gains can be made by addressing cultural problems. I mean, that's really what we're concerned about. Like, can we improve things by changing culture? It's that's more important than the causal ancestry of how we got to where we are. I think it's like going forward. Is there any hope of doing that, even if the goal is just making people better off, not equal outcomes, right?
Yeah, there definitely is room for improvement. And there's always going to be some room for improvement. And culture is something that we have a certain amount of control over. So, yeah, there is the possibility of positive intervention. Now, there's an interesting moral question which is never asked, which is, okay, let's say white researchers and psychometricians come up with an idea to improve Black culture, and they can get 5% more, study hours or something for if they impose some cultural intervention, like, and let's say this intervention might be resisted by many Black parents, which in many cases it would be. So what right do say white people have to impose their idea of what a good culture is on somebody else? Now, I don't have a good answer to that, but I would just highlight that as a moral problem.
That certainly is a moral problem worth considering. I want to ask you a little bit about the empirical side of hereditarianism. I know you studied it a lot more than I have. I have, dipped in and read some studies and know more about it than I did certainly like 7 years ago or something like that. And the result of my reading has been for me to take hereditarianism more seriously. But I still have this thought. You mentioned the results of a survey, I think, in one of your papers. I think it also came up in the Charles Murray, Sam Harris interview. That there was like a breakdown of like people who research intelligence. Okay, what percentage? What is your confidence that the Black-white IQ difference is accounted for by genetics versus environmental factors of various sorts? And there was like a breakdown of the results. You remember what I'm talking about?
So Heiner Rinderman et al. Conducted a couple of surveys of intelligence researchers. So there are people who had published on the topic of intelligence research in whatever it was, some last several years. And they asked, what percentage of the Black-white IQ gap do you attribute to genes? So it was from 10%, 20%, 30%, up to 100%, or zero, sorry, from 0 to 100%. And I believe around 20% of researchers said it was 0%. So the rest said that. Now, I don't think that it's worth, calling yourself a hereditarian unless you think it's at least 50%. So I can't remember the exact proportion that thought it was at least 50%, but it was a very substantial, probably majority of intelligence research. I thought it was a substantial percentage of the gap was explained by genes. My view is that this is an interesting finding, but if he conducted the survey and 90% of them said it's 0% genetic, that wouldn't make me change my views. I would just say that I'm able to evaluate the evidence myself, and I know that there's people are under tremendous pressure, not just to say, even in an anonymous survey. I mean, people tend to adopt the beliefs that are beneficial for them to hold. Most people are not dogged rationalists seeking out, only true propositions and then taking a stand for them. Like, that's not the normal human psychology. People believe kind of what it's in their interest to say they believe. So um, I think it's useful to cite that survey just to kind of loosen people's intuitions. If they think that hereditarianism has the same status as phrenology or flat Earth theory, well, clearly it would be very strange if that were the case. But then most people who work in the field are hereditarians to some degree. Now, I think that the survey was wrong and that they were still underestimating the extent to which the gap is genetic. So I don't hang my hat on that as like an important piece of evidence that for hereditarianism. But anyway, that was what the survey found.
Right. So I was thinking of this from my perspective. I am not super interested in race differences, to be totally honest with you, genetic race differences. I've done some reading about it. You've sort of urged me in that direction. I've done some reading about it, but I still sometimes have this thought, look, this isn't my field. I haven't really, in your Heterodox Academy piece, you said you should read these things and then you'll know. I think I've read everything you listed there, except I hadn't finished all of Human Diversity by Charles Murray. But I kept thinking, but if one of those 20% who was a 0%er were to challenge me and say, well, what do you, I don't think I could hold up my end of the argument with those people. So maybe the rational thing for me to do is just be open-minded, but to suspend judgment, right? Why is that not my rational response here?
Yeah, I'm not sure that you are obligated to suspend judgment just because you couldn't defend your view against an expert who holds a different view. I could not hold my own against a 9/11 truther who knows, exactly what the melting point of steel beams are, and knows that the airplane had this flight path, and I don't know any of that, right? Okay, I know a little bit about it. I know that some of the arguments about the steel beams and whatever. I know a little bit, but if there are trained engineers who are 9/11 truthers who would who know more about it than I do, and even if I could answer their questions, they might be able to trick me with some follow-up question that would be outside of my training. But that doesn't mean that, well, I have to suspend judgment and maybe 9/11 truthism is right. It's just wherever I look, I just see every credible source saying one thing, and then I see that the credible people they're always able to answer the 9/11 truthers in a way that seems very compelling. And, I feel I can even though I'm not an engineer, I can follow along enough to see which side makes sense. So, I think something similar can be said here, where you only have to scratch the surface a little bit when it comes to these debates to see that the environmentalist side is really grasping at straws. Now, I'm not 100% satisfied with the literature, the hereditarian literature out there, so I plan on writing a comprehensive defense of hereditarianism at some point. But I do think that the evidence should be within the grasp of the intelligent layman.
Maybe the intelligent layman who puts a lot of time into this, but I think you're overstating that significantly, to be honest, because I've paid peripheral attention. I haven't spent a whole summer, just trying to track down responses to environmentalist, arguments and responses to hereditarian arguments and this stuff. But, when I've glanced at it, I've always thought, oh, man, I'm going to have to learn a lot more about genetics and about these other things to know who's telling the truth here. That's been my reaction. So, for example, a very obnoxious person, somebody I don't like at all, Kevin Bird, he has this paper criticizing hereditarianism. I glanced at it and I thought, well, you know what? I don't have a degree in genetics. I don't trust the source. This guy is an insufferable social justice warrior. So I don't trust the source, but I can't like dismiss the paper just because this guy's a jerk or something, or even an ideologue that would cause me to question his results. Like I'm sure there are ideologues on the hereditarian side. So I think, yeah, I think for that reason, you're probably kind of too harsh on the genuine National Review conservatives. Like somebody like Rich Lowry, like he's not. You can't expect him to be in the weeds in this stuff, right? He just is going to be out talking about taxes or whatever.
Well, I don't expect him to, because my expectations for conservative thought leaders are low. But I don't think it's unreasonable to to hope that an intellectual leader of a major political movement would take the time to be informed about the most important issue, political issue of our time.
That this is the most politically important issue of our time is a very idiosyncratic opinion of yours that he probably doesn't share.
What does he think the most important thing is? Tax policy?
Presumably not that.
What? I have no idea. If it's not race and all of the issues that stem from race, I don't know what it is.
Nuclear policy is probably important, more important than this. Environmental policy is more important than this. Lots of things, keeping the economy healthy is maybe more important than this. There are lots of things that are more important than this. And by the way, you can push back on lots of the race stuff without accepting hereditarianism. Like the arguments for affirmative action will remain bad, even if the environmentalists are totally right.
Well, I don't agree with that. If all people were on average exactly the same, I would support affirmative action, because it's just some environmental factor which has caused blacks to be deprived of so many IQ points, so that we should just use the environment to correct that. A black person with an IQ of 85 is equivalent to a Jew with an IQ of 110. So treat him as such.
Well, but that's not hereditarianism. That's saying that IQ doesn't matter at all, not that the cause of it is genetic rather than environmental. I think you can accept, even if it's the case, just granting the case that it's the case for the sake of argument, that the wokesters are right about oppression causing all of these differences. Well, still, I want my brain surgeon to be the most qualified person. It's just a completely orthogonal to this, it seems to me.
Well, we have to weigh our obligation to produce good brain surgeons with our obligation to correct for the injustice. And so there may be cases where there's a conflict between these two obligations. But in principle, I would support affirmative action as a very intrusive affirmative action as a way to correct this. Now, to take another scenario, let's say North and South Korea became unified. Now, there might be some small differences among North and South Koreans in terms of innate ability, but it's probably not enormous. Right? The vast majority of the difference in outcome between North and South is due to the political system and the cultural factors. So if they became unified, the North Koreans would be much poorer than South Koreans, and they would be much less prepared for university, much less prepared to take exams, and so on. Now, in that case, I would support lowering the standards for North Koreans, because I know we only need to do it once, and then we're going to fix. We're going to send the smartest North Koreans to Seoul National University, and they'll figure it out, and then their children will be fine. Now, but it doesn't work when it comes to in the U.S. context, because these differences aren't the result of culture, and they can't be fixed. But if I thought that they were the result of culture, then that's what I would advocate.
I wouldn't. But I wonder what you would say if it turned out that the material deprivation of the North Koreans lingered intergenerationally, so that we were talking about 50 years on, we were still doing affirmative action for North Koreans to compensate for the material harm and the cultural deprivation that happened under the Kim regime. would you still support it?
Well, then that would be like the Great Awakening. So I say, okay, all this affirmative action didn't work. So like there's something else. Now that in that case, it's not perfectly analogous, because in that case, it was the Kims that are responsible for the bad thing, not South Koreans. So we wouldn't have to blame the South Koreans, but we would still have to take more extreme measures to bring about equality of outcome, which has so far eluded us in that scenario.
Interesting. Okay, so maybe we should move on to the question I wanted to start with, which on which I think we see eye to eye, which is wokeness is not going away anytime soon. So it seems to me that I've seen numerous announcements of the death of, even when they were calling it political correctness, the death of political correctness, over the last 10 years, like, oh, it's finally peaked, it's finally going away. And it's never turned out to be true. For example, after the Tuvel Hypatia affair thing happened, with her publishing that transracialism article there, a lot of people were like, okay, well, they've gone too far this time. Clearly, this is the peak. It's going to wane from here. It hasn't happened. It was clear that it wasn't going to happen. And I think there's a kind of self-serving narrative that's underlying this. I think what's people want to find evidence that it's ushering itself off stage so that they don't have to do anything. They're not responsible for anything. You can just, this too shall pass, have this Zen-like detachment and not put your own career at risk at all. Just let it all play out.
So as far as the psychological motivation of people who insist that wokeism is over, I think there are a number of reasons for that. As you say, one is to absolve himself of responsibility for doing anything. Well, the problem fixed itself. So I guess luckily I never had to take a stand. And just delusion, of course, wishful thinking. But there's zero evidence that wokeism has peaked. If you look at survey data, young people, and especially elites, are overwhelmingly on the side of DEI cancel culture. People with advanced degrees voted overwhelmingly for DEI Kamala Harris. And people think that, well, woke is over because of Trumpism. But this is just the plebs pushing back. This is not the elites. And you're not going to have a sustained victory of a bunch of incompetents. They're not going to be able to rule successfully for a long period of time. Now, whether the Democrats will recover politically and reinstitute the DEI regime it's not clear at this point, because the Democrats are so dysfunctional now. They don't seem to be able to field a viable candidate. We'll see what happens in the next few years. All that Trumpism has done is reinforce the identity of smart people's identity as liberals and Democrats and wokesters. So this stuff is not going away, and any institution that is run by smart people will continue to be woke. And nothing has changed.
One frustrating thing about this current moment is if ever the right starts to get some significant pushback to wokeness, or even attempt to ineffectually, people treat it like, oh, it's all over, it's done, we don't need to talk about this anymore. And it's also treated like this is the right unprovoked aggression against the left. Like, here we were minding our own business, teaching truth at Harvard, and then in came these bullies. And there's this immediate switch from this sort of triumphalism to this, cringing. We're being attacked by the administration, casting themselves in a sympathetic role. But so that's going on. But I'm not seeing any evidence of any people are really rethinking things. I can think of a couple of people who sound like they've been rethinking things, but by and large, the vibe shift just isn't happening.
To paraphrase something that Amy Wax said, that a lot of these people who are sounding the death of wokeism, I mean, They spend all their time on Twitter. And, you know, they don't work at in many cases they don't work at universities. They may not even have children. They're just kind of alone in their apartment on the internet, and then they get this impression that from Twitter that woke is over. But in the real world, that's not happening.
And your view is it will continue to grow as until the hereditarian revolution happens.
Well, you can undermine wokeism with hereditarianism, or you can become so immoral and or so stupid that you don't care that wokeism is the logical consequence of your belief in environmentalism. So the alternative is we remain environmentalists with respect to race differences, but our society becomes so collectively stupid and immoral that we just don't even care about wokeism because we don't care about ethics or in general, or we just, it just leaves us cold. So there might be some of that. So that's why the right rejects wokeism. The right accepts the equality thesis just as much as the left, but people on the right tend to have low IQs and to be generally people of low moral caliber. So that's why they're not woke. So we might become de-wokeified for that reason, but that's not really what I'm hoping for. My claim is in order to defeat wokeism and replace it with something better will require a hereditarian revolution.
All right. I don't quite agree with that assessment, but I'm glad that we have been finally able to hash out, this discussion about wokeness, which it seems like we've kind of indirectly been having for like 10 years now. And I'm glad to finally get this on the record. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Well, thank you again for having me on. Very good conversation. If people are interested in seeing my work on this topic, they can read Nathan Cofnas's newsletter at ncofnas.com.
And I will have that linked in the show episode description. Thanks again.
Thank you.